The title of this webinar reflects that of Dan's book, The Daycare Myth: What We Get Wrong About Early Childhood and What We Should Do About It. While we unfortunately couldn't fit the complete book title for our webinar, it doesn't mean we've forgotten about that second crucial aspect that Dan references: what we should do about it. All of our expert panelists here today are extremely excited to dig into that crucial point so that you can all feel ready to take what you learn and implement it in your classrooms, communities, and states. With that, I'm excited to introduce our panel that we have here with us today. Please note that I'm just providing a brief preview of everyone, and that full bios will be posted in the chat box. Our main presenter for today's conversation is the author of The Daycare Myth himself, Dan Wuori. Dan is the founder and president of Early Childhood Policy Solutions, a public policy consultancy focused on the needs of America's young children and their families. Following our presenter conversation with Dan, we'll be hearing from three incredible commentators. Daniel Haynes is the Managing Director of Policy and Professional Advancement at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, or NAEYC, where he leads a portfolio that includes federal and state policy and advocacy, higher education, and professional recognition. Lisa Roy is the Executive Director for the Colorado Department of Early Childhood. She served as the Director of Program Development at the Buffett Institute and also served as Executive Director of the Early Childhood Department at Denver Public Schools. And Jessica Sager is the co-founder and chief executive officer of All Our Kin, a nationally organized nonprofit that trains, supports, and sustains family childcare providers to ensure that children and families have the foundation for success in school and in life. And guiding these wonderful commentators and presenter is Ellen Galinsky in the role of moderator. Ellen is the president of Families and Work Institute, an organization she founded in 1989. She also serves as senior science advisor to AASA, the school superintendent organization. Ellen is also the author of renowned books, Mind in the Making, which focuses on early learning, and The Breakthrough Years, which is her newly published book on adolescence. For those interested in Ellen's work and her research, we encourage you to visit her website, ellengalinsky.com. I'll be posting that in the chat for folks who want to access. And we encourage you to subscribe to her free Substack, where she shares research on a regular basis. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Ellen to get this wonderful conversation started. Ellen?
Thank you so much, Sierra. I had the wonderful privilege of getting this book in a PDF last summer when Dan asked me for a quote, which I very happily did on the back. It feels like a conversation with Dan, I know, because I've had 3 to 4 or 5 years of having the privilege of talking to Dan. We pulled together a group of leaders during the pandemic, leaders in states, to talk about what was going on and what we could learn from each other. It was a bipartisan group. We interviewed leaders about how to take the lessons from the campaign and take them further. And I wanted to say before we get started that I'm so grateful to the Saul Zaentz Charitable Foundation for your work there, Dan, but also for sharing this book and promoting this book within the field. It's really nice to see that happen, and thank you, Elliot Steinberg, for making that happen. Dan, for as long as I can remember, and that goes way back, people have been arguing that we shouldn't separate education and care. I remember in the 1980s, Betty Caldwell was so frustrated with this that she invented the word Educare. Probably most of you don't know that the name of the program, Educare, at least was originally named by Betty Caldwell, or at least she didn't name the program, but she came up with those words. When I ran for president of NAEYC in the late 1980s, it was on the basis of a book that I wrote that argued that we shouldn't separate education and care, that there's nothing in the baby's brain that gives evidence, or the young child's brain that gives evidence that the part of the brain needs care and part of the brain needs to learn. And went on to do that for years with the campaign that I worked on with Rob Reiner and with called the I Am Your Child campaign, and then with Mind in the Making. At NEYC, we argued when President Bush put out the national education goals that we shouldn't separate education and care. There have been so many, I think Ralph Smith would call us the armies of the persistent, who have argued this for so long. And Ralph himself said that during the pandemic, people understood that schools really were childcare organizations and childcare organizations really were schools. Why is now the moment that this will finally take hold? I think that I think it is this moment, but I'm really curious from you about why now.
Well, Ellen, let me begin just very quickly with a word of thanks to the campaign for grade level reading for their interest in pulling this conversation. And as you mentioned, you have been such an important part of my growth in the field of early childhood. I have considered you a mentor since long before I could really call you my colleague and my friend. And so I'm so grateful to you for helping to moderate this conversation, for your support of the book, and also to our panelists who will join us later. It is a real who's who. So I'm just so grateful to be here. To the point of your question, like why is now the time? I guess I'm reticent in a way to say that now is the time for precisely the reason that you laid out in your question. I mean, truly, the time was decades ago, but they, as they say, there's no time like the present, right? To begin remedying your mistakes. I don't know if you are a fan of musical theater, Ellen, but I recently saw a production of Mamma Mia, and the song "Slipping Through My Fingers" is such a powerful part of that musical. For those of you who might not know it, it is a mother sort of reflecting on the passage of her daughter's childhood and how quickly that goes. And the bottom line here, from a policy perspective, is that every 12 months we wait is another cohort of young children whose first year has passed without are really taking the time and the effort, not at the family level, certainly, but systemically. We are missing the opportunity to really optimize the development of young children. And that is sort of the premise of the book. It takes a look at some of the major lessons from what we know from the science of early development, and then sort of juxtaposes those against how that knowledge is reflected, or in many cases, sadly, not well reflected in our public policy in this country. And it makes the case, Ellen, that we have created actually sort of a bizarro world for children where things are very much the opposite of the way that they ought to be. We know, for example, that the first 45 months from prenatal through age 3 is arguably the most consequential period in all of human development. I want to acknowledge, by the way, your fantastic work on the breakthrough years, which really uplifts the importance of adolescence as well. But I think you and I would agree that so much of the critical foundation of the brain is laid and sort of metaphorically wired during those earliest months and years of life. And yet at the same time, we have a public policy that dictates that for example, during the very months and years that stable, nurturing relationships with highly engaged adults are what can help to forge attachment and form the foundation of our positive mental health for decades to come, is interrupted. In this country right now, in the sense that 1 in 4 American mothers actually have to return to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. It's an astonishing figure, and certainly not reflective of every individual in this country. There are some who are privileged to have, jobs that have much more robust benefits, but particularly for those working, low-waged hourly jobs, those benefits simply don't exist. At the same time, our out-of-home settings are inaccessible, they are unaffordable, they are unprofitable, And they are premised on the low wages, the poverty level wages of an almost entirely female workforce, and in many cases, majority women of color. um, I could go on and on with the list, but the bottom line is that we have created a system that is not well aligned with the needs of young children. And my hope has been that this book is an opportunity for us to just press pause, to reflect for a moment on what we know and what we need to do better. And interestingly, I was fascinated to watch the names pop up in the chat here as we went live today, and so gratified to see participants from all across the world. Uh,
Yes.
Participating. The sad truth is, the more I have engaged in recent months, I'm actually planning an international tour to talk a little bit about this book, and have been, a little bit depressed, honestly, to find just how universal the themes in this book really are. It uplifts some, very American parts of the conversation in terms of the specific policy approaches, but the big level, the high level themes of this book about, respect for the sector, the, failure to understand the real importance of the early years is, sadly more an international conversation than I think sometimes maybe we want to acknowledge. So there's really, could not be a better time than now, in my estimation, for us to have this conversation on a bipartisan basis. If there's anything that we should be able to agree to, it's this.
So, are there particular arguments? You are out and about. Are there particular arguments that are more successful today than maybe they might have been in the past? I mean, you've talked about brain development, you've talked about what's happening with the parents, you've talked about the issues with the child care workforce and early childhood workforce. What issues, what arguments are most powerful in your experience?
Yeah, it's in recent years, I know in the introduction it was shared that I sort of lead now this public policy consultancy. Prior to that, I spent 5+ years as sort of the founding early childhood director at the Hunt Institute, which is a resource to the nation's governors and state lawmakers, and so really have spent the past 6+ years now sort of traveling across the country, working with gubernatorial administrations, working with state elected leaders. And what I have found is that, and frankly, this is one of the major themes of the book as well, is that investment in children and families actually offers something for everyone, right? There's something for everyone to like in this, regardless of your role, right? Whether you're a new parent or grandparent, or whether maybe you don't have children of your own, or certainly don't have young children of your own at this point, and are just looking at this as a taxpayer. There is a lot to say for investment here, and there is a lot to say for why this makes good sense regardless of your place on the political spectrum. I had the good fortune, and continue to have worked in sort of the bluest of the blue and the reddest of the red states. And I think, to your specific question, Ellen, I think what I am finding is that, that there are different arguments that resonate with different groups of people. I think for a very long time, we in the early childhood field have relied heavily on sort of a moral argument that this is the right thing to do for children, and what some might consider kind of a warm and fuzzy message about the importance of brain development. And I have found that message is breaking through. Increasingly, elected leaders say to me, I get this now. I feel like I've got the brain development piece of this. The bigger question in some cases is how do we pay for it? And so I think for policymakers who may not be otherwise inclined to be a part of this conversation right now, and particularly since the beginning of the COVID epidemic. I am finding that in many states, the economic argument for investment in young children, whether it is questions around workforce participation and the prosperity in the state. The book outlines two different streams of thinking, very much interrelated on the return on investment here. Certainly looking longitudinally, now that we have studies that span a period of decades that show all of the ways that high quality early childhood investments can mitigate against some of society's costliest problems, whether that's remediation and retention, or special education in our K-12 system, whether that is excessive reliance on social services in adulthood, whether it's poor health outcomes, or even something as severe as interactions with the criminal justice system. We know that these investments pay long-term dividends in ways that right now we are, as a society, paying endlessly for the results of our inaction, rather than paying for kind of thoughtful, proactive investment on the front end. But we know simultaneously that there is a real-time economic question and driver here. Our colleagues at Ready Nation here, about a year and a half ago, released an amazing report that looks at the real-time drain on the American economy created not by childcare writ large, but just by infant toddler care and the lack of high quality infant toddler care. What they found is, that each and every year we are losing 122 billion with a B, dollars, as a result of that. And so, there is a long-term return on investment case to be made. There is a real-time, economic benefit and or right now drain on the economy as a result of our inaction. Those economic arguments are powerful, and I'm seeing in many of the states that I'm working with, that it is really that return on investment argument that seems to resonate with many policymakers.
Well, I think what you say is so important. When in the early years, when we were arguing for not separating out education and care, it was seen as an us versus them. Child care, early childhood was called stranger danger. We were talking about how it might destroy the family. We were arguing against that. It looks like all of the research that people have done over many years from many different vantage points have led to a situation where it's not an us them anymore. It's just, how do we do it? But that their arguments, and your book is a wonderful Cliff Note resource for all of the arguments that people could use. And I see people are putting them in the chat, which is great. If you have things to share, please do. Like Indiana just listed the share right there. Please put them in the chat. But it looks like we're at a point where we can try to begin to make things happen. I'm wondering though, before we start on some of the details of how to make them happen, what do you think we should call this field?
Oh, it's a great question, and very much sort of the premise of the title of the daycare myth is admittedly something of a provocative title on purpose. But for the better part of 100 years, Alan, we have sort of invested ostensibly in young children in this country in ways that really have much more to do with adult workforce participation than they have to do with the optimal development of kids. And we have fooled ourselves, for decades, and continuing to this very day, to think about this artificial divide between care and education. We have fooled ourselves into believing that there is this thing called daycare or childcare more recently that is separate and distinct from education. And I want to be really clear on this point too. When I talk about these settings being educational, I think there's always a risk that that those of us in the early childhood field know well, that over a period of years, there has been sort of a temptation to push down content and to make the early years increasingly academic in their focus. When I talk about, these settings, for example, being
So important.
deeply educational, what I am definitely not talking about is extending the K-12 system down to birth, nor am I talking about, creating classrooms that are excessively didactic or academic. I think, it's important to recognize that in the same way that we can think about the needs of first graders and graduate students sort of falling under the broad umbrella of education, I think we can think about infancy and toddlerhood in the same way. That doesn't mean teaching babies with flashcards. It means exposing them to the kinds of nurturing one-on-one interactions, and through play, and all of the developmentally appropriate things that we're talking about. So, I have made the argument in the book that we move away from these care-based titles, daycare and childcare, and you just heard me say, that nurture, for example, is something that is incredibly important. And so I want to distinguish that, in the book, my use of the word care and my description of care as a low bar relates very much to this idea of sort of custodial care, of that these environments exist solely for the supervision of young children. And Ellen, you may know, because we've talked about this many times, but I see over and over, like newspaper editorials that say, oh, well, okay, our child care industry is in crisis. The real solution, doesn't have to do with investment. It means that we've just overregulated these programs, and so what we need to do is strip away anything that isn't related to the basic health and safety of the children who are attending these programs, almost as though they are envisioned as like a holding facility for young children while their parents go to work. And that really is the definition of care that I think we need to
Get
get
away
away
from.
from. So that's a very wordy way of saying, whether it's early care and education, or simply early childhood education, or maybe even just school. I think the words that we use matter, and the part of changing the tenor of this conversation means sort of getting away from some outdated terms, or terms that may have some inadvertent
Yeah.
baggage associated with them, and that's going to be an important part of changing public perceptions here.
Well, I think we'll have a contest in the chat. We've already had some wonderful suggestions about healthy development and so forth, for what we should call it, but I want to keep moving towards solutions. So I'm going to first ask you, you not only have done all of this policy work with governors and with legislators in a bipartisan way, you're really hands-on, but you're a kindergarten teacher, you have a background in the classroom, which is so wonderful. What and you've seen directly that different states come up with different solutions. What are the values, if you could just list them quickly, because I want to make sure we get to solutions, but what are the values that we should that should underline or underlie the disparate kinds of solutions that a Montana or a West Virginia or an Illinois or a Louisiana should have?
Sure. I think one of the values that I, attempt to convey across audiences in this book is just that the early years matter. And they matter in ways that go above and beyond, frankly, above and beyond what we in the field, I think, even sometimes give them credit for. The the first chapter of the book sort of unpacks we see in the press almost every day, some variation of this headline around childcare being in a state of crisis, right? Whether it's a compensation crisis, an access crisis, an affordability crisis. The book makes the case that those are actually all symptoms of a larger crisis, which is just a crisis of understanding. That we are failing to recognize how important these years are. So I think the primary value that underlies my work is that children matter, that these years matter, that they're equitable access to the supports that families need matter. And I would say too, those who have read the book know this, but to my point earlier about not advocating for a universal sort of one size fits all approach here, I am very much a supporter of what we call mixed delivery, right? And sort of a pluralistic approach that has really been the way that this country has delivered early childhood education for decades. This has not traditionally been the domain of the public schools. It has been, a service that is provided by, church preschools and, private and community-based programs very much. It's been provided by family, family friends and neighbor, care providers through, home-based, family child care. And so the book is, one of the values that I hope comes through very strongly in the book is the need for us to invest sort of pluralistically in allowing families to make important choices for themselves. And one thing that we haven't mentioned that I'll hush here is part of that is taking better care of families who might wish to stay home with their children. I don't I remained somewhat agnostic as to the approach here, but the book really highlights what do young children need developmentally, and then what are the options in terms of making sure they get that, right? Then that can happen in a high quality program outside of the home, but it also very much can and in many cases and in many people's estimations should happen within the home. Unfortunately, we have created policies at the state and federal level that are really not conducive to that. We know that roughly 2/3 of Americans, American children under the age of 6, live in households where all available adults participate full time in the workforce. What we don't have great data on is how many of those families want it to be that way, right? If there were, and to what extent is that simply an economic necessity for those families, and how might their choices differ, given the opportunity to take the first 6 months or the first year of their baby's life and spend that at home. And so the book advocates for a wide array of policy solutions here.
We should respect everyone, including educators, families, the diversity of families' needs, children, and so forth. And we should build the system. And Eric just says in South Africa, they call it early childhood development. Early learning is what we say at AASA. But we should build the system on what people need. What are your major suggestions at the federal level? What should happen at the federal level? We're going to go to the state level next, but what give us a couple of things that you think should happen at the federal level.
Yeah, well, so I think the way the book sort of makes the case actually breaks out nicely almost along this federal and state question. I think ultimately what we need is transformative investment in young children and families. And that is likely something that can only happen, or certainly only happen equitably across states at the federal level. Will that cost something in the short term? It certainly will, but I think the book makes the case that we are wise not to think of that as a cost, but really as an investment, right? That we know about the long-term returns here, and that we know, for example, that these investments hold the potential actually to help us shrink the size of government, right? That's been this back and forth debate between our political parties for decades about sort of the role of government and the size of government. The problem in that conversation, Ellen, has been that the solution to shrinking the size of our government has always been reliant on, what might be described as really draconian cuts to programs that families rely on. But I think, I would make the case that there is an opportunity here to shrink the size of government, to shrink taxpayers' obligations, um, not through drastic cuts, but by eliminating some of the need for those services, right? That we already talked about, how these investments can mitigate against some of these very costly outcomes. And so, at the federal level, I think, what I can only advocate for is, a transformative investment in children and families, supporting, as I mentioned earlier, lots of strategies in a very mixed, sort of pluralistic approach. What I know, though, from my work in policy and with elected leaders in recent years, is that really transformative change very rarely happens in one fell swoop, right? And so, and particularly right now, in a divided national political context, with a divided Congress, it has been frustrating to see the lack of progress made by our congressional leaders, for example. And so a lot of reliance has shifted to the state level, where they are taking matters into their own hands. Two great examples have been here recently. Obviously New Mexico got a lot of attention, about 2 years ago, for the passage of a constitutional amendment in the state that guarantees now the right to early childhood funding in the state. That constitutional amendment, incidentally, passed with sweeping, overwhelming bipartisan support. The state's Democratic governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, was actually up for re-election during that same cycle. She garnered 52% of the vote to be re-elected. This constitutional amendment for early childhood, though, passed with 70% of the vote. And so
How do other
voters.
states do that, Dan? What should other states do to get to a place? We'll move to the states now.
Sure,
What
sure.
should other states do to have something happen like happened in New Mexico?
Well, I think it's so interesting because if you know about the New Mexico story, you know that that constitutional amendment was funded in part through oil and gas revenues, right? That the state has such amazing natural resources, that have done very well in recent years, and so it has been a real boon to them. And so I've talked to lots of policymakers who say, oh yeah, don't tell me about New Mexico, because they're kind of a unicorn. They have this amazing, natural resource that, helps to fund it. But I think there are other states. Vermont is a good example to lift up, to say, where there's a will, there's a way, right? About a year ago, the Vermont legislature passed, again, with widespread bipartisan support, a small payroll tax in the state, that will increase the availability of child care subsidy very dramatically. I mean, makes it available to all, but really the very top income earners in the state. Is poised to help to address the compensation crisis in the field. I worked very closely here in recent years with the state of North Dakota, that used some of its general operating revenue to dramatically increase the availability of child care subsidy in the state. So the states are taking the lead in the absence of action by Congress. I think ideally what we'd like to see is probably both, right? That there is at least some floor that ensures, when we have states that are acting on this in isolation, what it creates is this sort of patchwork quilt of, children in Vermont may have, access at this level, and children in Idaho may have access at a very different level. So, I think it is incumbent on all of us to be reaching out and helping to educate policymakers at both not only the state and federal level, but even local, policymakers on the importance of this period and the needs of children and families.
Okay, we have just about 10 more minutes with you, Dan, so I want to cover before we go to our panel, but I want to go now to ask you what changes need to happen among those who work in this field. What should happen among people who, and we'll be talking about this in the panel too, but what should happen among organizations that represent educators or family child care or public education, or Sarah Gould just wrote, we all need to cooperate more with each other. That would reduce a lot of spending. But can you give us a few ideas for what you think ought to happen from, by those of us in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I already hit on this a little bit, but I do think, those of us in the field who feel strongly about this really need to change the terms of the conversation. And one way that I think we can do that is by, encouraging those in the field to really claim their titles, right? That as long as these programs are thought of as being daycare, then that's how they will be seen. And we don't always do a great job. I mean, there are lots of programs still across the country who have that word on their sign right out in front of the building, right? And so claiming the titles, of these businesses, helping policymakers, the public to understand that these are geared around child development and geared around important forms of early learning can only help. I think it is incredibly incumbent on all of us to help change the titles, though, that we use for the early childhood workforce. It pains my heart to hear any of these professionals referred to as daycare workers, right? Or even child care providers. These are not babysitters. I think that's one of the lessons for parents in the book is that as you are making this selection, this is one of the most consequential decisions you're making in your child's life. You are not choosing a babysitter. You are choosing the adults who literally will help to co-construct your child's brain. And that's a very different way of looking at this profession and its value. And, the longer we refer to them as daycare workers or, something other than educators, the longer this will persist. And so, a part of my advice to the field is claim your titles. I really like the comment that you were reading from the chat around our, better cooperation. One message that I, would give loud and clear to those who are listening who work for public school districts, for example, is that it is incredibly important that you, maybe among all others, be mindful of your influence. The one of the real challenges that we know has happened in this field in recent years as states have expanded, for example, public pre-K, that there has been a threat basically that 3 and 4-year-old children, who are the very children who enable the fiscal solvency of the childcare sector, being drained out of these private and community-based settings and very much threatening the availability of infant toddler care, which really cannot be provided, in many cases, even at a break-even point. It's it's so labor intensive, so costly that many early childhood providers or programs think about infant toddler care as almost like a loss leader. I equate it to like the sales on Black Friday before Christmas when the stores have big screen TVs for $45 or something. Like, I mean, it's a service that's being sold at a loss in hopes that you'll come in and buy other services that are more profitable. And so, school districts can play a terrifically important role in the early childhood ecosystem, but they can inadvertently, and with all the best intentions, play a very destructive role in that ecosystem. And so, it's important that school districts in particular really are thinking about the unintended consequences of their actions, and maybe be looking for opportunities to partner with community-based providers rather than taking on the obligation of providing service
So I think
themselves.
you've given us a challenge. All of us are going to be not allow ourselves to be called by the wrong names. We're all going to adopt the right terminology. I once did a study of family child care and relative care. And a woman in that studies, when asked when she would go to the proverbial party and people ask her what she did, she would always say, "I'm in investments." Oh, stocks and bonds? No, I'm investing in this country. And so I think changing the language is really important. I'm going to ask you one last question before we
Sure.
go to the panel, which is about quality. So much of this depends on having, if we're going to use the investment argument or if we're going to use the brain development arguments, we need to make sure that what children are receiving really does promote their healthy development, their learning, their thriving. How do we what are your suggestions for maintaining quality or improving quality in the system?
Well, I think it's been interesting to watch over the past several years that even the definition that states are using for quality um, seems to be shifting a bit over time, and in positive ways. I think for a long time we looked at structural quality, right? That we looked at things in the classroom environment, right? The height of the sinks and the number of books on the bookshelf, and you know. Certain hygiene practices and things, all of which are important unto themselves, but we also know that that's not the extent of really what quality looks like. That we need to be focused increasingly on what we call process quality and interaction quality. Some of the advice that I give to parents, there's a section in the book around helping parents to identify a high quality program for their children. And I really hammer home this point that, as you are making this selection, here's the way that parents can think about quality, and maybe the fastest test of quality. Go and visit, right? And when I say go and visit, because I think almost everybody goes and visits, to some extent, but frequently that visit is sort of a walk down the hallway with the director where you peek in the classroom windows and maybe you kind of stroll through a classroom for 30 seconds. But take the time and ask for the time to really take some time and observe in the classroom, and take an hour and see what this place is like, and go in and watch the adults in the classroom, right? That if what you see in a toddler classroom, for example, is a pair of adults who are standing in the corner having a conversation with one another, then that if that's happening in large part, that may well be a red flag. If, on the other hand, what you see is adults who are down on the carpet, working eye to eye with young children, extending their language, extending their play, boy, that's a sign of a great program. And that we can't be too dazzled as parents by the sort of facilities themselves. I've been in some absolutely amazing, clearly multi-million dollar buildings that have all of the right aesthetic. But let me tell you, if, given the choice between a beautiful building and highly engaged adults, go with the adults every time.
So we're going to now open it up to the panel. I see the things going on in the chat are so fabulous. We're all solving this problem together. We're all in it together, from bumper stickers to don't consider this a commodity. So I'd like to begin with you, Jessica, and say just a quick response to some of the things that we've been talking about and that Dan has said.
Yeah, thank you. So first, let me say I am so energized and fired up by this conversation. So thank you. Dan, you are so right. What childcare providers are offering is indeed education, and it's also care. So at All Our Kin, we work with family childcare educators, and we call them educators very deliberately because they are engaged in education. And so we see this very vividly. Family childcare educators operate small childcare programs in their homes. It's the major source of support for infants and toddlers, for families working evenings and weekends, and for whole communities. And what we see is all the ways in which the system is failing not only children, but parents and the educators themselves, and all the ways in which family childcare educators are stepping up to fill that gap, from creating warm, nurturing, high-quality learning experiences for our youngest children, to supporting parents so that they can be successful in the workforce, to creating businesses that are generating real returns to the economy. In fact, we've shown that the educators that we partner with return $15 to $20 to their local economies for every dollar that we invest in them. So we know that they're teaching children, and not just pre-literacy and numeracy, but empathy and curiosity and grit and perseverance. And we know that we're making it possible for parents to go to work. But what we see is that the educators themselves are paying the price, which is just wrong. They're paying it in their foregone wages, in the lack of respect, in the long hours. And so to reimagine a world where we put educators at the center of the system and actually invest in and pay and support and train and value and celebrate them, I think will be a real game changer for this country. I think it's a moral obligation. I think it's an economic obligation. And I think it's something that all of us should care about.
How how absolutely fabulous, and I love that your emphasis on the word educator. I think insisting what people get called, and not letting people use the old language is one step. We've got a lot of questions about how we actually afford this. We'll get to those in the Q&A, but I want to go now to Lisa, Roy, from your perspective. Any responses, or what are your responses to the conversation so far?
Dan, I really appreciated the book, and it challenged me in some of my thinking. I've used the term born learning, for instance, and we have incredible programs here at the Colorado Department of Early Childhood, which include home visitation programs. We have a universal program that we're trying to spread around the state, Family Connects. We have Nurse-Family Partnership, Parents as Teachers, the home instruction for parents of preschool youngsters. And again, it's just so important to support parent choice. We do a mixed delivery system for our universal preschool program. And I will tell you, I've gotten some interesting feedback nationally about that. We include licensed home-based, center-based, and school-based programs. In our first year, we had over 60% of eligible 4-year-olds participate. And again, it's been so telling because we are honoring parent choice. Parents were making these choices all along the way. Now the public funding is supporting that parent choice. So again, that bipartisan support from our legislature and governor was very important. But thinking about care versus education, thinking about the terminology we use and ensuring that, again, the goal is around optimizing learning and development for young children, understanding that birth to 3 is important. And in our state, that's where we have the hardest time, actually, is ensuring that we have, again, I mentioned preschool, not a problem. But do you think we have 60% of our infants and toddlers that are eligible for slots, getting them even with our child care development funding? And no, that's not the case. So appreciate so much of what you had in the book, Dan, and your push for giving advice to parents and to policymakers about what we can do. But again, for Colorado, we are in a space where we have a lot of support from our governor and the legislature, but definitely don't have all the funding we need for a comprehensive system that you discussed.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much. Now we're going to go to Daniel from NAYC's perspective. Any responses or your responses to what we've been talking about?
Thanks, Alan. And there's just so much great conversation to unpack here. Also, want to apologize if you can hear any background noise. I'm living my issues. We have 3 sick children under 5 in my house right now. So apologies for any fussing in the background. I really want to reflect, Dan. I love the term used, bizarro world for children in terms of how we invest in systems. And I know we're going to talk about solutions, but I saw some questions in the chat as well about what we're spending per child on K-12 education versus what we're spending on early childhood education. And as we get to that conversation about solutions, I think really acknowledging that what we're asking for and what we're trying to push for in terms of investments in a comprehensive system that values early childhood educators across all settings is not really that expensive in the context of what we are spending in other systems and in the context of what we get, because it is so critical. And Dan, I really appreciate your book lays this out clearly. That brain development of those first 3 years, first 5 years is just so foundational, so crucial for how children learn, how children set themselves up for success across the year. And the work of early childhood educators, whatever setting they are in, is so complex, so difficult. And I like that idea of really focusing on what the complexity of that work looks like, because whether we call it education or care, we often use early care and education because early childhood education can look like care and requires care to be high quality early childhood education. It is really deep, complex work to individualize, provide developmentally appropriate practice, support children in developing not just math and reading skills, as you mentioned, Jessica, but developing some of those social emotional skills and some of those, core ideals that are going to help guide them through the rest of their life in terms of how they learn to interact with others, how they learn to behave in different situations, how they learn to share and not be selfish. And it is so deeply complex work that we do not reward. And I think that's the key takeaway that I want to have here today is we have incredible educators who work across all systems, across all settings, who are being paid like they are not professionals, like they are not really highly qualified, highly supported individuals. And we need to ensure that we are flipping that on its head and that compensation and professional supports and recognition is at the center of all the conversations that we're having about the workforce. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here and discuss your book and all these ideas today.
You are all singing from my songbook about the importance of executive function skills that are social, emotional, and cognitive that are so crucial to help kids thrive. And so back to you, Jessica. And what does the system that we have now get right and what does it get wrong?
Yeah, so first let me say, it's really our educators that are getting things right. And they are finding ways to work around and with the very limited resources that are available to them, whether that's helping families apply for subsidy or finding ways to participate in Head Start childcare partnerships or stretching a dollar in all kinds of ways that they shouldn't have to do to create these safe spaces where children are learning and where parents can thrive. And we definitely have visionary leaders like Dr. Roy who are working to create those systems. And I'm so excited to see that. And I do think there is momentum across the country to build systems of support that pay educators fairly and include them. I can say that from my perspective at All Our Kin, because we work directly with educators in New York and Connecticut, but 31 other states have asked us to come in and help them think about their childcare systems, sometimes at the government level, sometimes at the CCR&R level, sometimes an educator-led association, but we do see that momentum growing. So that gives me a lot of hope. What we get wrong, I think we need to recognize that it is in all of our best interests for our children and our early childhood system to be thriving. And it matters to everyone. These are the kids that are going to go on to be the workforce of tomorrow. These are the parents that are working side by side with you today. This childcare system, childcare and education system, should matter to you whether you have children or not. The second thing is that we need to acknowledge that thriving children require thriving adults. If you are exhausted and stressed out and struggling to make ends meet, then asking you to be a wonderful teacher, that's a huge burden. It's a burden for educators and it's a burden for parents. And so if we really care about children's well-being as a society, we absolutely have to care about their parents and educators too. And there are so many things that follow from that, about funding the true cost of care, about enabling parents to pay for care. But because I have my wonderful colleagues here, I'm going to pause now and hand it over so they can talk about that.
Well, we are actually now doing a thriving workplace index. We're piloting it in Head Start and with the state of Nevada, because we know that the work environment really, it's compensation and benefits and those things are absolutely critical, but the workplace environment that early childhood educators are working in is also critical. We need, for thriving children, we need thriving adults. So let me go now to Lisa and say, what does the system get right and what does it get wrong?
I'm going to start with what it gets wrong, Ellen.
Okay.
Dan
I
did such
switch
a
those
great
back and forth.
Dan did such a great job. I mean, Colorado, like most states, are experiencing an early childhood workforce crisis due to low wages, inadequate benefits, and high turnover. I was in Longmont, Colorado, and I had a woman who works with monolingual and bilingual teachers, home-based providers is what our typical term is, but we're going to change that to teachers, to educators, to professionals. And she was just saying, I own my home, but I don't have any retirement benefits. I don't have health benefits. She says, if I got sick or have cancer, I'll lose everything that I've worked for. And that's pitiful. It's a shame, as you pointed out, Dan, in your book. And for a person who takes care of dogs and cats to make more than people who are working to build the brain architecture of our future workers in our communities is shameful. So we know that early childhood professionals are vital to the success of Colorado, for instance, and that we also know that caring for children is hard work, and turnover in the field just causes and creates toxic stress for young children, and they have to deal with the trauma of teachers cycling in and out. And so it's simple to retain high quality educators. We have to have pay that reflects their importance and the difficulty of the work. And we need to build on that system. We have to have the funding. We also, Dan, as you pointed out, need to make sure that there are incentives to get credentials, to continue your education. And I'm an example of that. Myself, I was someone who was a family friend and neighbor provider who got my associates, bachelor's, master's, and by the time I was a grandmother, I had my doctorate. And I won't go into all the stories, but I had to do this because I couldn't afford childcare. I went back to school so that I could help support my family because I couldn't pay for childcare with just working. So that's why I did FFN in the first place. And so many of our early childhood professionals get into care and education because they're parents who can't afford childcare for themselves. So it's important for us to support them. And the teacher preparation piece, along with it, we just also need to make sure that we're giving early childhood professionals the dignity and respect they deserve. I remember visiting Reggio, and they don't make a whole lot of money, I would say, as Reggio teachers, but they are treated with honor.
Yeah, so much of what we're talking about is how to change the story, how to change the names, and how to change the stories. And I had always wondered in our society why we don't pay people who do the most important jobs more money, and why we pay actors and sports figures. But what I understood when I was doing research for the breakthrough years was the storytellers in our society get paid the most money. So we need to become better storytellers. And that swings it over to you, Daniel. What does the system get wrong and right?
Yeah, I know. I could just echo what both of my fellow panelists shared and agree with them on so much. I agree. What we get right is our really diverse field of committed early childhood educators who work across a broad range of settings, who are passionate about the work, about the children and families they serve, who, even while they are not supported themselves by broader systems, are creating incredibly creative solutions to support development appropriate environments for learning and creating really complex problem solving to help support children's learning. We owe this workforce, we owe the educators that serve our youngest children an incredible debt of gratitude. What we get wrong is that this should not be a field that you have to make sacrifices to be in. We have the economics of the system are completely broken. There's not equitable public funding to fill the gap between what parents can afford to pay and what providers can afford to charge. And so because of that, it's the early childhood educators who are sacrificing their own family's financial well-being to participate in the system and to provide the most important education and support for families across the country. That needs to change. We also are cutting off a pipeline of future educators because if you can't see yourself in this field as a professional, you don't see professional pathways, you don't see opportunities for higher compensation, you may love education, love children, but you're not going to go into an early childhood setting because you know that making $12 an hour is not going to pay your own bills and you're not going to have a pathway for success and support. And so the answer to all of this is really helping create public funding systems that help bridge that gap, again, between what parents can afford to pay and what providers can afford to charge, because we need to ensure that every early childhood educator is receiving professional compensation supports. And Lisa, I appreciate that you said that the honor, the recognition that this valued profession. Dan, you mentioned, and I hear from educators I speak to with Macy regularly, we're not babysitters, we are early childhood educators. And it's both that professional recognition and the supports and the compensation. And that compensation piece is so critical that we are doing horribly wrong right now. And the answer at every level is more public financing because the economics of the system are just so fundamentally broken.
We need to be really good storytellers. Let me go back to you, Jessica. So solutions. What solutions do you think either that we have now or that we should work toward are most important?
Yeah, so first let me say we do see these leaders in the field. We see what's happening in New Mexico. We see what's happening in Vermont. We see what Dr. Roy is working to do in Colorado. And I know some other folks on this call who are piloting innovations. I think telling the story of those innovations' impact in a compelling way to your peers has the potential to go a long way as a solution in inspiring others to follow your lead. That's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is during the pandemic, we actually saw states and the federal government implement a lot of the solutions that we now are fighting for again. So money to supplement educator wages, expanded eligibility for help, subsidy to help pay for care for more children and families, even things like health and mental health supports for educators and families. We put these structures in place during the pandemic. That shows that we can do it, and we've actually learned how to use those muscles, and we can do it again if we make a shared commitment to do so. The last thing I want to say is educator advocacy and voice, together with parent advocacy and voice, is so, so important. And we have seen educators coming together across the country with parents and sometimes with business leaders to advocate for solutions to our current childcare and education system. And educators know the best ways to change the system because they are living it every day. And so creating spaces where educators are in community with each other and have the space and the time and the resources to do that work of building advocacy and coalition, I think is really critically important.
Yeah, I've loved the push that we've had to get childcare into the national political discussion, and it's been pretty effective, actually. So look at what we can accomplish. Dan, remember when we had all these speeches lined up to talk about the passage of the Build Back Better Act, except that it didn't happen, so we didn't have to do any of those commitments that we had all signed up for. Okay, so Lisa, solutions.
Well, I love that the federal government is looking at the cost of care. We need to get from the failed market rate survey and actually look at what the cost of care is in every setting and make sure that our early childhood professionals are being paid a living wage with benefits. So I'm excited about that. Now, without more money, we're going to be serving less children. So we're going to be pushing children into all types of settings because we're taking away eligible slots that we previously had. But it's so important to pay for the cost of care. So I'm excited about that. Dan, you mentioned us in your book on page 98 about our tax credit, our early childhood credential. And we paid for the last few years up to $1,500 per professional. And 13,564 early childhood professionals participated, and over 18 million went to them through this tax credit. I think there are a lot of innovative ways that we can continue, as Jessica pointed out, to use the funding that we have currently in the system based on what we've learned during the funding that we received during the pandemic, and highlight those best practices, really push them. But again, what I see as important in every way is to pay the same rate, like I mentioned, what as far as what we do with our universal preschool program, as far as workforce development, again, pushing for credentials, having coaches. We have early childhood mental health consultants. That's important for retention and recruitment of professionals because they know they have someone to talk to about behaviors that they might not know how to address. And for our department, with the funding that we received, we had 3,500 higher education scholarships and supported over 4,000 enrollees in early childhood programs. So that's something we want to be able to continue to do, and really have appreciated the federal funding and the flexibility. So those are the things that I would point out.
And Daniel, solutions.
Yep. Again, I agree with so much of what my fellow panelists have already said. I think the huge investment that we made during the pandemic, $50 billion in new federal funds to both stabilize the supply of childcare through ARPA stabilization grants and to support supplementing existing childcare subsidy programs to help parents defray the costs of care were so critical. And the proof that we've seen from that when you invest directly in supply, you do help lower costs for families. You do help create more options and create more choice. And we talk a lot about mixed delivery systems and creating choice. But when we have an underfunded system where the supply of care is so limited beyond what is needed, it actually limits choice for parents, even when they can use subsidies in a variety of different settings, because the slots aren't available. And we saw that when we invested money directly in supply, directly in compensation, we saw educators stay in programs longer. We saw turnover decrease. And I'll drop in the chat a link to NACE's surveys that we did over the course of the pandemic that really showed just how impactful those investments were. And it's been great to see states across the country learn those lessons and continue to invest directly in supply, directly in compensation. We heard some examples from Dr. Roy, the work that's happening in Colorado. We've seen New Mexico, Minnesota, Massachusetts. Vermont's doing some really exciting work in investing in affordability, accessibility, and quality, and creating a pathway towards professional compensation for early childhood educators. There's incredible leadership happening at the state level. And I think as we're looking across the country, there's so many examples that we can build on and follow. I also want to highlight a really important change happening at the federal level. And Dr. Roy, you alluded a little bit to this, which is the CCDF final rule that was finalized by the Administration for Children and Families last spring. It includes significant improvements to how the subsidy program is administered across the country. Caps family copayments at 7% of income and encourages states to eliminate copayments for low-income families. Improves provider payment practices to better reflect market practices, just paying based on enrollment instead of attendance and paying providers prospectively rather than retroactively. It increases the use of grants and contracts to serve children with disabilities and infants and toddlers. Dan, you mentioned some of the challenges in how we administer CCDF in your book, and I'm really excited to see that the federal government is already taking some actions to move in a better direction that more accurately reflects the true cost of care. To do that effectively across the country, it's going to take more investment, and that's the theme I'm just going to continue to harp on, is we need public dollars to back up these great policy solutions. But it's really encouraging to see states taking those lessons from the pandemic, that when we invest in childcare and early learning, when we invest in early childhood educators, it makes a real difference. And we're already seeing the impact of those investments in supply in states that have made investments versus states that haven't. So there's a lot to learn over the course of the next few years of what effective strategies are working to support this field.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and suggest part 2 to this webinar, because I've been watching the fabulous solutions that are also coming in from the chat. And I think we should have a part 2 where we take the issues of affordability, of public awareness, of quality and so forth, and really do a brainstorming. Let's create the army of the persistence checklist of things that we could actually all do. So now we have, as scheduled, 15 minutes for your questions, and we have, I think, 15, so we're not going to get to them all, though the speakers and the panelists are committed to answering all of you afterwards. But I'm going to start with Sarah Gould's question, which is, in what way do you feel are the easiest ways to teach the general public and legislators about the importance of public education for the youngest children, how to show that this is a valuable research to have as an option? So quick answers, because we want to cover at least 4 questions. Starting with you, Dan, and then all of the panelists, or any of the panelists who would like to talk about this.
Yeah, Alan, I would say quickly, we've talked a fair amount about the book today, but another component, or sort of a companion piece to that, is work that I have been doing over the past couple of years on social media, really trying to illuminate the importance of the early years. And so taking some of the available, video, for example, that is available kind of out in the public domain at this point, and illuminating for parents, yes, this is cute, yes, this is adorable, but it's so much more. And I think, let
me just stop for a minute. Do you all know what Dan posts on LinkedIn and Facebook? Because you should follow him, if I'm sure most of you are. But the cutest, the kind of videos that go viral. But he does a little child development lesson with him. It's brilliant, Dan. Go back.
But I see the two of them as going very much hand in hand, Alan. It's my own effort to create sort of a public awareness campaign, I guess, if you will, on just the important development and the important learning that is happening during those early years, and raising this up is more than cute. And so, I think
More than cute is the tagline.
the social media and the book, though, very much go together, right? That it's on the one hand, I hope helping people not only here in the States but across the globe to understand just how important and just what we know about early development. And then the conversation we're having today, and the bulk of the book is really dedicated to the associated question of, if we know how important, if we know that learning begins prenatally, for example, how does that change the conversation from a public policy perspective, and what do we need to do differently? And so that's been my simple answer, is really trying to uplift both of those things.
Who would like to jump in from the panel about changing awareness?
Ellen, I'll go next. I totally agree with Dan. And yet I also think one of the issues that I've experienced as someone in public policy for more than 3 decades, pushing for supports for families, is that many folks think it's the responsibility of the family for birth to 3. And secondarily, it's the grandparents. And yet many people don't understand that families are not living in communities where their parents, the aunts and uncles of their children live. Many are living alone in a city at times without any supports. They barely have friends that can help them. And so really helping our legislators and policymakers to understand who are the people in their community, who are the people in their state or their city, and what supports do they really have available. I'm a grandmother. Do you think that I can stay home and take care of my grandchildren? I would love to, but financially I can't. I'm preparing for retirement myself. So it's unrealistic in some ways if a policymaker thinks you have all you need when you have a child. We really need to help our policymakers to understand that families need supports, and if they get those supports early, ultimately children will do better in school, will save money, all of the things that Dan mentioned in his book.
Okay, we're going to go to Martha Ray's question. I know we could talk about public awareness, but I want to get to at least more questions. Martha Ray asks, quality is an animating topic in most states. Quality practices are driven by legislation. They respond to statutes and not learning environments. How can we shift the dialogue on quality from our current scope to discussions of authentic quality? Dan?
Sorry, take a minute to get unmuted. Yeah, I address, I at least try to address this in the book as well, Alan. And I think, I think the question is spot on, in that, a lot of what's wrong in our state and federal policy is actually specified in state law or in regulation in some cases. And so the book, those of you who have seen it know, is sort of written for 3 primary audiences simultaneously, right? For parents, for policymakers, and for early childhood professionals. And I try to square that circle by, there is a section at the end of each chapter that I call the bipartisan blueprint for change, that speaks directly to each of those audiences. And no question, as important as the other 2 audiences are, my hope is that this book speaks very directly to policymakers about, even some low-hanging fruit, they can jump in statute and fix quickly in ways that will be, long-term and consequential in changing this conversation, going in and removing references to daycare workers, for example, right, and changing that to early childhood educators. Congress has, Daniel mentioned, the market rate surveys that are, are being used at the federal level to, sort of encourage states in setting their rates for subsidized care. And we know, for example, that even at 100%, the 100th percentile of the child care market rate, that is a rate that is premised at this point on poverty level wages, on minimum wage for those who are working in the field. And so, the book is not shy about calling out the use of market rate surveys, frankly, as a form of public policy malpractice in my mind. That for the federal government to say to states, do your best to assess what's being charged, which we know is an insufficient rate to begin with, and then we encourage you, pretty please, to try to get to the 75th percentile of an inadequate market rate to begin with, is just unconscionable. It's a way that federal policy is inadvertently exacerbating the financial crisis that this industry finds itself in. And so that's a good example of a place that, in fairness to our great colleagues at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, that's something that's written into federal law at this point. It's not something the department can just get rid of. But boy, let me tell you, if there are members of Congress watching or congressional staff who are watching today, talk about a low-hanging fruit. In a place that in a not a terribly controversial way, you could get in there and make a very important change very quickly by changing what federal statute says about this.
I'm going to just jump right to the last question, and we really have because I have one final question for all of you, but let's just go straight to compensation. Maybe one of Daniel or Jessica or Lisa want to start with this. How do we get compensation reform is the question. Not small.
I'll jump into this first and say, again, it requires public investment first. Again, our entire system is premised on a market-based system where parents are paying for a good. And Dan, I think you lay out really clearly in your book that childcare and early education is a public good. This is a system that should be treated as a public good. It should be treated as education. It should be treated as, critical infrastructure. And that is the key ingredient that is necessary for supporting higher compensation is public investment. I appreciate that you mentioned moving from market surveys to cost estimation models, Dan. I think that's really critical in terms of one clean step that legislators can do to make the case for paying subsidy rates that reflect the true cost of care that can then translate into higher compensation. But undergirding that is the need for more public dollars into those systems and into the subsidy programs so that families that currently have subsidies tied to the market rate don't lose access to those subsidies when the value of those subsidies increases to be more reflective of the true cost of care. Because when we're operating our system of just very, very limited public financing, and I can't emphasize enough how limited the financing from the public purse in the sector is, there are always going to be harmful trade-offs. And to the metaphor of the three-legged stool that's in your book and that a lot of us use, they're always going to pit the needs of parents and programs and educators against each other and quality against each other until there's enough money in the system to finance all three. And so that is the critical need is we need the investment, and it needs to be tied to policies that align with the true cost of care.
Well, fortunately, I suggested that we have a continuation of this discussion because we have such an incredible group here and an incredible group who are participating that there is so much more to cover. But I'm going to end with, if you had one wish, and I'll do you, Dan, last. If you had one wish to improve the early learning system, something that is aspirational but it's doable, what would that wish be? So I think I'll start with you, Jessica.
Yeah, great question. So one wish, I would say a fully funded system that compensates educators fairly and makes it possible for all parents to afford care. It's a mixed delivery system that includes educators in all settings, from family childcare to center and school-based, and honors parents' diverse backgrounds and cultural preference. And as Dan points out, not only is this not impossible, we can't afford not to do it.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'll go to Daniel next.
And depending on the power of this wish, I'd love to see early childhood educators paid like the other storytellers our society and make the millions of dollars that our professional athletes make. But I think Jessica's vision is actually a very strong one that I can support as well. We need a publicly financed system that covers the true cost of care, that recognizes and values the diverse professionals that are doing this work, that creates pathways for higher compensation and creates a baseline of compensation that is not just livable, thriving wages and benefits beyond just wages, and that ensures that families have access to a diversity of options that meet their needs and that meet the needs of their young children.
And Lisa.
I would just say ditto, but again, compensating our early childhood professionals with living wages and benefits. They have to have retirement benefits and health benefits. Anything we can do also to have forgivable loans for school would be helpful. Opportunities for professional development, as Dan mentioned, to ensure optimal development for young learners is important. And again, that parent choice piece that we all have discussed is important. And that would be it for me. That would be a dream come true.
And Dan, you have the final word.
I will say amen, amen, amen to each of our my fellow panelists here, and just express the wish, Ellen, that we move away from the way that we are thinking of this system and financing this system. As a closing comment, we are financing programs for children and families very much in the style of a payday loan in this country, where we are meeting our immediate obligation from year to year at literally the highest possible cost to taxpayers across a span of decades. It's time for us to move away from this decision to pay for the errors that we make, and instead think about how we might stop making them, fund the system proactively, to the benefit of children, to the benefit of families, and to the benefit of all taxpayers and society.
Well, you've heard my wish that we continue the conversation. Corey Bartage just said we should start with a one wish question and go from there about how to make it actionable. So maybe that's our part two. Thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. There is a survey that should have propped up on your screen. And we can't take it, but you all can. So will you please fill it out, and I'll turn it back to Sarah and Sierra with any final words. But I want to thank this incredible group of Dan for your work forever and this incredible book, and all of you for just such insight about how to get from today to tomorrow.
Yes, and thank you, Ellen, for moderating a great conversation. It was great to have you leading everyone through all these questions. And thank you, Dan and Jessica and Lisa and Daniel. This was fantastic. And while I don't pull ultimate sway, I will try my hardest to get a part two to the conversation, because I agree. I think this is something that we all benefit from. And I mean, the amount of questions and chat messages reflects that as well. Before you hop off, like Ellen said, if you could respond to our engagement poll, that would be great. We'll also be having a poll in the follow-up email that you all receive on Friday. And also wanted to turn your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on the 8th, like Leah said, we'll have a session on data insights and global strategies for accelerating education recovery. On October 15th, we'll have a double header with a funder to funder conversation, and then a Kindergarten Matters conversation at 3 p.m. And there are many more opportunities in the works. So registration links will be posted now. As a reminder, the recording, resources, the link to Dan's book, all of that good stuff will be included in the follow-up email that you receive on Friday. But thank you so much again, everyone. This was a fantastic conversation, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Have a good rest of your evening.